Get ready, because today we're going to continue our discussion on how to write a novel, and we're going to focus on the subject of drafting your story. What's up, guys? My name is Brandon McNulty. I'm a writer, I'm the author of Bad Parts, and welcome to my writing channel. If you missed my previous video, it was the start of a new video series that I'm doing on the subject of how to write a novel. And in this series, I'm going to be talking about my own novel writing process and what kind of techniques I used, and hopefully this will help you if you are struggling with the writing process or if you're just looking for some new methods to make it easier. So today we're going to talk about the drafting process, and just so we're all on the same page, what I mean by drafting is the actual writing, the actual nitty-gritty writing part of the process. And there are different ways that you can approach this. Some people approach the drafting process by just coming up with an idea at the start and chasing that idea until they get to the very end. Others like to do a lot of outlining before they even start writing at all, and that's totally fine as well. Me, I'm somewhere in the middle of that. I'm not quite one of those people who just rushes into things, but I'm also not one of those people who stresses out over outlines. I usually just do what I did in the previous video, where I come up with that idea web where I have the central idea and I branch out from that and I try to see where I can make connections and where I can generate characters and events and settings and so on that I can incorporate into my story. And once I have those rough basic ideas of what the story is going to be about, I will dig into the writing process and move along from there. Now, the first draft is what a lot of people call the discovery draft, and I like this term. The discovery draft, it hints at the fact that you will be discovering your story as you go along. You're not going to know everything from the start, and you can't expect yourself to. It doesn't work like that. But when you actually dig into the writing and you go through it, you will find that a lot of things change. Characters you thought you knew make decisions that you never saw coming, or events arise that you never saw coming, things like that. Another thing I like to call the first draft, in addition to the discovery draft, I also like to call it the gambler's draft, because you can and should be taking major risks throughout the first draft. This is very important. If you want to come up with a story that is creative and fun, you need to take risks, especially early on in this stage. This is the stage to do it, because the first draft is going to suck. And since it's going to be a mess, you might as well make a mess in style. And that means that whenever you hit major moments in your story, like a character has to make a major decision or some big event is going to happen, take chances here. Have a character do something that you never thought they would do. Something that's realistic for them, but something that you never expected. Something that makes you uncomfortable as a writer. That's key. Do things that make you uncomfortable. If you pictured the story playing out a certain way, allow it to go completely off the rails. Allow it to go into territory you never expected. Take those risks. Let the story get wild and creative. Let the fun ideas explode from the middle of this draft that you're writing. And don't worry about it, because you can always make changes in future drafts. Now, another valuable technique that I bring to the drafting process is this idea that I always chase excitement. So here's the thing. A lot of people have this idea that when you're drafting a story, you start at the very beginning and you go all the way to the end. I don't do that. I actually will start my story with something that excites me. It may be the opening scene. It may be a scene 25% through the novel, or it may be a scene in the dead center middle of the novel. And you might say to yourself, well, how do you know what's going on with the beginning of the story? And that's actually how I learn about the beginning of the story. Sometimes I will start with a scene that excites me. And let's say, for an example, let's say we're writing Jurassic Park. We talked about that in the previous video, so we'll talk about it again today. Let's say we're writing Jurassic Park. And instead of starting at the beginning where we get introduced to the scientists and we get a lot of, paleontology and all kinds of stuff like that, instead of that, let's say that what really excites you is that scene in the middle where the T-Rex is terrorizing the people at the park. That's what excites you. That's the scene you really want to write. And for me, I would start right there, and I would write that scene. And yes, I wouldn't know how it got set up or anything like that, but I would write the scene as I envisioned it. Okay, a T-Rex breaking out of its cage and people running away from it and running for their lives and lots of excitement going on. And you know what I would learn from that scene? I would learn that that particular scene needs to be set up in a particular way in order for it to work. If a T-Rex is breaking out of a cage, then that means that the cage had to have previously held them. So how did that T-Rex manage to break loose? Did something fail with the cage? At that point, I would realize that the cage and its 10,000 volts of electricity are unable to stop the T-Rex. So I have to set that up properly. And in order to set that up properly, I have to look back and say, okay, well, maybe something causes the electricity to go out. Maybe something like a storm that hits the island. Or maybe something like a scenario where one of the park's employees, one of the people in charge of keeping the park online and keeping the electricity going and keeping everything working, maybe one of those employees decides to betray the owner, and that sets up this sequence of events. So that's an example of how I might start a story. Instead of worrying about getting all the setup details right, I just jump into the fun parts and see how they play out and see what kind of pieces need to be in place for them to work. Now, the final thing I want to talk about in today's video is what to do after you finish your first draft. What I typically do after I finish the first draft, I will actually open up another Word document and I'll start writing about the draft I just wrote. So I'll write about how I felt about the draft. I'll write about what worked, what didn't work, what can possibly be better in the second draft, what needs to be added, what needs to be cut, those sort of things. What I also do is I also come up with another one of those idea webs that I talked about in the previous video. If you remember, I start with a central idea and then I branch out to the different elements of the story and I try to make connections between different things. Once you finish your first draft, you're going to notice that you have a lot of new ideas that arose from the drafting process, a lot of natural ideas that just stemmed from the events of the story. So you're going to have to include those in your new idea web and figure out, okay, what ideas are connecting? Are there ideas that are, strongly connecting to the central idea as well as some other elements in the story? Are there ideas that aren't really connecting to anything, or maybe they're only connecting to one particular element? If that's the case, cut those ideas. There's no shame in throwing out those ideas. Even if they're fun and exciting ideas, get rid of them. If they don't connect to your story, they don't belong there. You can always save them for another novel that you're writing or a short story or whatever. The key thing to remember with this stage of the process is that you want to take stock, you want to see what's working in your story, what isn't, and you want to prepare yourself for that next draft. How can you write a draft that works, that is solid, that is logical, that is exciting? That's what you need before you go into your second draft. And when you approach your second draft, you're going to rewrite the story from scratch. Yes, you're going to rewrite the whole thing. I know that sounds intimidating, but you need to rewrite it. That first draft, like I said, it's going to be a mess. So the second draft, hopefully it'll be less of a mess. Maybe it'll be good enough to get on to the revision process and the editing process, which I'll talk about in future videos. But if it's not good enough, if it's not ready to be revised, that's nothing to be ashamed of. You can do a third draft. And yes, this is a lot of work, but if it's what it takes to get the story right, you need to do it. So I hope this helps. Question of the day: have you ever finished drafting a novel? Let us know in the comments section below, and if you didn't finish drafting a novel, let us know why you stopped. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, pick up a copy of Bad Parts if you haven't already. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, hit the like and subscribe buttons for me, share this video with a friend, and as always, remember to keep on writing.